Hi, my name is Dave Maynard, and this class is called UFOs. What are they? And by UFOs, I mean unidentified flying objects. Now, just to give you a little background about me, I have a bachelor's degree with a major in physics and a triple minor in astronomy, chemistry, and math. I have taught high school chemistry, physics, and math, and I did teach an astronomy course at our local community college. I have also done graduate work in astrophysics, so I'm a little bit familiar with the topic that we're going to be talking about. Now, on your handout, you can see the class syllabus, and we're going to be talking about 9 different types of things in relation to UFOs. The first thing we're going to talk about is we're going to look at the 7 different types of close encounters. A second thing we're going to look at are there are basically 2 different kinds of UFO groups out there. There's the naturalist or the skeptics, and then there are the spiritualists. And we'll go into defining who those are and how they operate, that sort of thing. Then we're going to take a brief look at the history of UFOs, starting in about 1600 BC and ending with the modern era of today. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to then examine some of the physical anomalies of UFOs. Now, what do I mean by physical anomalies? Things like they tend to defy our physical laws when they're operating in our space, in our atmosphere. They tend to change shapes in flight. Sometimes they're detected on film, but not by sight. Sometimes by sight and not on film. Sometimes they're detected on radar. Sometimes they're not detected on radar. And sometimes they're detected on every other radar pulse. So these are some of the things I mean by physical anomalies. A few other things are we have them on camera as flying into the ground, and then sometimes a short distance later they'll fly out of the ground. There's also an absence of air friction, and by that I mean sonic booms. We've clocked them at going way above the speed of sound, and yet we don't hear any sonic boom. Now again, in our atmosphere, anything that's physical that goes faster than the speed of sound is going to produce a sonic boom. And then we're also going to discover, can UFOs come from another planet? And if they can't, where do they come from? A fifth thing we're going to discuss is, are UFOs extra-terrestrial, and by that I mean are they from another planet, or are they interdimensional? And I'll let that sink in for a second, and we'll talk about that. Then a sixth thing is we're going to examine the message of the UFOs. Now here in America we don't hear a lot about the message of the UFOs, and quite honestly in other parts of the world they hear a lot about that. But the message of the UFOs from the 1950s maybe to the mid-70s were a couple of things, and then from the mid-70s to today, they've kind of changed that message a little bit. So we'll talk about that. A seventh thing we're going to talk about is we're going to examine alien abductions. And yes, these are people that claim to have been taken by aliens aboard their spaceship. How they happen, who they happen to, what they do when they abduct a person, and we might even look at how to stop an alien abduction. An eighth thing we're going to look at is a spiritual connection. Is there a spiritual connection? You may be surprised at this. We're going to look at what that connection is, where it's coming from, and maybe how to evaluate it. And the last thing we're going to discuss, we have to discuss when we talk about UFOs, and that is the incident at Roswell, what it is and what it isn't. Okay, now the first thing we're going to talk about is the 7 different types of close encounters. I know everybody's used to the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and we're going to talk about that. But the first kind of close encounter is just labeled DS, and that stands for distant sightings. And that just involves somebody that can observe lights or a disk in the sky visually or even on radar at a distance of more than 500 feet. So you can't really see much, you can just see something that's out there. A second type is close encounters of the first kind, and that involves a sighting of a UFO at 500 feet or closer. And again, you're just seeing it, that's all. A second type, or a third type, is close encounters of the second kind. And that's when a UFO will leave a physical mark on the environment, such as maybe broken tree limbs, or when the UFO lands, it will leave a landing mark, like burnt grass or an impression in the grass, or if there are cars nearby, they will lose electrical power, that sort of thing. So that's a close encounter of the second kind. Another one, and the most popular one because of the movie, is close encounters of the third kind. And that involves a sighting of a UFO when you can see the occupants in the UFO, and that's at a very close range. Another type is close encounters of the fourth kind, and this involves alien abductions of people who were taken on board UFOs for some type of experimentation. These episodes are usually forgotten, but they're only uncovered by hypnosis. And again, we'll talk about all these in depth. So then there's close encounters of the fifth kind, and this involves a contactee. Now, what do I mean by a contactee? That's a person who claims to be in contact with UFO entities, usually through what we would call occultic means, like mental telepathy, channeling, things like that. Then there's close encounters of the sixth kind, and that involves injuries or death from encountering a UFO. And yes, there have been several cases of that are documented. Before we get into a history of UFO sightings, I want to just mention a few people that are some of the most respected UFO researchers in the field. And this field, strangely enough, is called ufology. Dr. Jack Valley, who, and I'm probably butchering his name because he's a Frenchman, he is a computer scientist and an astrophysicist. He co-developed the first computerized NASA Mars mapper. He also worked on creating ARPANET, which was a precursor to the internet. So unlike Al Gore, he kind of did have something to do with the invention of the internet. Then there's Dr. J. Allen Hynek. He's a U.S. scientist. He is deceased. He is an astrophysicist, and he is a Northwestern University professor. And yep, that's the Northwestern that's in the Big Ten. He also was a scientific advisor to the U.S. Air Force on UFOs. There's also a guy named John Keel. He is in the U.S. He's a journalist, and he is widely regarded as one of the most reputable UFO writers. There is also Major Donald Kehoe. He is a retired Marine officer in the U.S. He is also deceased. He is a pilot, and he is a writer. There is Captain Ivor McKay, who was in the British military. He's retired, and he is the former head of BUFORA, which is an acronym for the British UFO Research Association. There's also Dr. John Mack of the U.S. He is a psychiatric professor at Harvard University School of Medicine, and he is an expert in the effects of alleged alien abductions and their effect on the people. There's also Dr. Pierre Guernin. He is a Frenchman. He is also deceased. He is an astronomer or was an astronomer and a senior researcher at the French National Council for Scientific Research. Jerome Clark in the U.S. is a researcher and writer, and again, widely regarded as one of the most reputable UFO writers. And then there is Joe Jordan in the U.S. He's an engineer. He is also the Florida State Director of MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network. He is also a Christian. Now, there are basically two different types of groups that you could divide UFO groups into. The first one is the naturalist or the skeptics. Naturalists generally don't believe in a spiritual connection to UFOs. They kind of lean towards the belief that these are beings from another world. Some of the naturalist groups are like Flying Saucer Review magazine, Bufora, the British UFO Research Association, and MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and there are a lot of others. Then you have another group called, we'll call them the spiritualist. They believe that UFOs are beings from another world or another dimension who are here to help our planet through a transition time in our evolution. And it's a transition time to a higher state of existence. Some of these groups also believe that these alien beings are here to help incorporate our planet into some type of galactic federation. But we've got to listen to their message and do what they ask us to do before we can be moved to this higher plane of existence, or before we can become part of this galactic federation. Now, there are some people and some groups that kind of believe both of these views, so it's not just a cut and dry thing. But those are the two groups. Now let's take a look at a brief history of UFO sightings. In 1600 BC, the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III, and again I'm probably butchering that name, he saw circles of fire that dominated the sky, but they left a terrible stench, a terrible odor. In the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries BC, many Romans saw UFOs. People like Pliny, Seneca, Tacitus, and Livy. Pliny spoke of seeing a fiery shield in the sky in 85 BC. Livy spoke of phantom ships, like big sailing ships with sails and mast, things like that. In 329 BC, Alexander the Great and his troops were frightened by large luminous shields that spit fire around the rims, and they buzzed and frightened his troops all night long as the troops were trying to cross a river. So it obviously took them a while to cross a river. Interesting thing, there were very few sightings reported in the first 500 years of the Christian era, of the first 500 years AD. But UFO activity started up again in what we call the Dark Ages, or the lower Middle Ages, in the 6th century. In 583 AD, Gregory of Tours, who we recognize as the first real French historian, mentioned globes of fire that moved about in the sky. During Charlemagne's reign, which was from 742 to 814 AD, 4 people were nearly stoned to death because they were seen falling or floating from aerial ships. Now these 4 Frenchmen said they were carried away by supernatural beings who showed them strange and unknown things. The only thing that prevented them from being executed is the local bishop, Agabard of Lyons, managed to save their lives by convincing the judges that the event never really happened. Then in Japan, on September 24th, 1235 AD, General Yoritsumi and his troops watched strange lights circling and moving in loops in the sky. It went on all night long until the morning. And on August 13th, 1491, Facius Cardan, who is a respected Italian Renaissance lawyer and mathematician, reported an encounter with 7 men who suddenly appeared to him. They claimed to be made of air, they denied the immortality of the soul, and they denied that God had made the world for all eternity. They seemed really interested in theological matters, and they described a system where God is constantly recreating the world, and it would cease to exist the moment it incurred God's displeasure. Now, this disagreed with the origins of the universe at that time, and of course, it disagrees with our origins of the universe now. But the interesting thing is some philosophers were circulating similar ideas at that time. These 7 men were dressed in togas, and they had armor over the togas. They said their lifespans were 300 years. And when asked to reveal their knowledge, they said that there was a special law that would penalize them if they did. Where have we heard that before? The Star Trek Prime Directive? Interestingly, before the machine age arrived, the UFOs remained as natural phenomenon. They were describable without recourse to mechanical terms. The Egyptians saw suns. The Romans saw fireballs and flying shields. These were things that were within their powers of description. But with the advent of the industrial age, the sightings changed. They were now of flying machines rather than fireballs or luminous clouds. It appears that the UFO show is always a little bit beyond the capabilities of those observing it. A great example of this is the airships of the late 1890s. And I'll be showing you some examples of that as we're talking. They'll come on the screen. But they had propellers, they had porthole windows, they had antennas. Some of them looked like submarines in appearance, and there were hundreds of such sightings. In fact, on April 11th, 1897, a photograph was taken of one. Today, when we look at that photograph, or when we look at the drawings that people made of them, they really look like sailing ships with mast, propellers, porthole windows, things like that. Hundreds of people saw this one on April 11th, 1897, because it lazily floated above Chicago, Illinois. Apparently, the occupants weren't worried about it because they knew we couldn't pursue it as flying hadn't been invented yet. One was also observed above San Francisco. Also in 1897, a former U.S. congressman and a guy who was a current farmer at that point, and his name was Alexander Hamilton, and yes, he was a descendant of the real Alexander Hamilton. He and 2 other people, 2 other friends of his, witnessed an airship hoisting a cow up by cable. The congressman saw 6 inhabitants, presumably through the portholes. The spaceship left with the cow, but the next morning the head, the hide, and the legs were found cut up in a neighboring field. Now, Alexander Hamilton said he was hit by a light beam from the airship right before it hoisted up the cow by cable. This ray gun phenomena has been reported elsewhere in the 1800s. Then, in 1909 and 1913, big flaps occurred. Now, a flap is when you have a group of UFO sightings. So big flaps occurred in 1909 and 1913, but the new sightings were yet again improved. They now looked so much like blimps that Germany had to deny that they were her new dirigibles. They were sighted over Toronto, England, Wales, and Germany. Because they traveled so slow, they could be observed very accurately. And again, we'll show you pictures of this as I'm talking. and they went from basically 25 to 100 miles an hour. Again, we couldn't really pursue them very much. The early planes, we didn't have that many of them. But in 1933, Norway and Sweden experienced many nightly sightings, but again, the new UFOs were improved. Now, by this time, Sweden had airplanes, but the UFO ghost flyers, as they were called, were faster. They were observed to have 6 engines, and I don't mean jet engines, I mean like propellers. And then none of them had any insignia on them. In World War II, Allied pilots saw what they called Foo Fighters, or Kraut balls, and they saw them close up. Now again, they were faster than any of our airplanes, and some of them, for the first time, seem to have the ability to change in flight, change shape in flight. And they were observed over 3 continents. After World War II, the improvements kept coming. This time they were cigar-shaped, and they emitted orange flames from their tails, suggesting some sort of rocket propulsion, and they achieved speeds up to 500 miles an hour. Now again, at the end of World War II, the jet engine was just developed, so the rocket-type propulsion was just starting at that point. Then in 1947, this marked the modern era of UFOs. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean in force, and they were seen everywhere in the U.S. But again, they were yet improved. This time they were disc and saucers rather than cigar shapes. The event that started it all was in June 21st, 1947, private pilot Ken Arnold saw a formation of 9 saucers. He is the one that said, hey, they looked like a flying saucer. This is when the term came into use. 7 days later, on June 28th, a UFO chose to do some remarkable acrobatics, over Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. How better of a sighting could you get than over an Air Force base? The next day, on June 29th, one was spotted over the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico, again, another government facility. And get this, in the summer of 1952, UFOs buzzed the White House all night long, coming and going. Now, when they came, of course, that's the most protected airspace in the world. We would launch our jets, they would go after them, the UFOs would disappear at incredible speeds. In fact, one of the UFOs was clocked at more than 7,000 miles an hour. And after a little while, our jets came back down, and then the UFOs came back. We sent our jets back up. The UFOs went off at incredible speeds. That went on all night long. The UFOs even showed up on radar screens. The next weekend, 6 to 12 UFOs buzzed the White House again in 2 separate groups. Then in 1956, the White Sands Proving Grounds again was visited by a UFO, but this time it landed on the ground near busy U.S. Highway 70. Nearby autos experienced electrical failures as traffic's backed up. Many, many people saw this landed UFO. After 10 minutes on the ground, it made a whirring sound and it flew away. In the Gemini 4 space program in the 1960s, astronaut James McDivitt saw a cylindrical UFO with antenna that was on a collision course with his capsule. Now, it veered off at the last minute, but he saw 3 other UFOs on that mission, and in each case, the ground control unit experienced a blackout in monitoring the Gemini 4 craft. Now, the 2 other astronauts saw nothing, but then the ground control picked up the UFOs on radar. Several other astronauts on other missions reported seeing UFOs. On January 1st, 1993, Mexico City became host to the most astonishing and the best documented UFO event in recorded history. Tens of thousands of people, including police, military personnel, and just ordinary citizens, sighted a silvery craft performing aerial acrobatics over the central city in broad daylight. It was caught on film. Later that day at 3:51 p.m. and 5:21 p.m., two other metallic disc-shaped craft did similar things and were camcorded by local residents. These two events lasted for a total of over 5 hours. Wow. 1996 was a banner year in Israel for UFO sightings, and researchers note this: the sightings appear to be occurring almost exclusively over the tiny little landmass of Israel rather than throughout the Middle East.